3 seconds. That's how long it took for Elena's entire world to shatter at the company gala, where she should have been celebrating as the CEO's wife, though instead, she stood there drenched in wine with divorce papers materializing in her husband's outstretched hand like a magic trick gone horrifically wrong. Daniel's face carried no remorse, only the irritated efficiency of a man checking off an unpleasant task on his to-do list, while his mistress Vanessa, the woman who'd infiltrated their lives 6 months ago as his executive assistant, smirked with the kind of victory that tasted like poison dressed as champagne. But the real dagger came from the in-laws, the people Elena had supported financially through her secretary's salary that was actually carefully calculated allowances from her real income, the family members who'd lived rent-free in properties her trust secretly owned, the very same people who now applauded Vanessa like she'd rescued their son from a terrible fate rather than destroyed a sacred vow. What none of them suspected, what Elena had guarded more carefully than her pregnancy itself, was that every dollar in Daniel's business account, every contract that had miraculously come through in the past 3 years, every investor who'd taken a chance on his startup, all of it traced back to her, the global trillionaire's sole heiress who'd orchestrated an elaborate test of love from behind the curtain of normalcy. She was Elena Montgomery, though only her lawyers and her dying grandmother knew it. The rest of the world, including the man who shared her bed and put this baby in her womb, knew her as Elena Rodriguez, the hard-working secretary who'd supposedly maxed out credit cards to help fund his dreams. The prenuptial agreement he'd forced her to sign to protect his assets would be comedic if it weren't so tragic, given that her family's lawyers had let it stand purely as part of her social experiment, knowing that the Montgomery fortune was protected by trusts older than Daniel's entire family lineage. But now, as Vanessa's wine-stained handprint marked Elena's dress like a brand, as Daniel's mother kissed the mistress's cheeks with maternal warmth she'd never shown Elena, despite 3 years of devoted care, as his father declared, "This is how it should have always been," Elena felt something shift inside her that had nothing to do with the baby and everything to do with the woman she'd been before she'd tried to become someone worthy of ordinary love. The question wasn't whether to reveal her identity. The gala was being held in a hotel her family actually owned, hosted by companies her consortium controlled, attended by people whose careers could end with her phone call. The question was whether the moral lesson she'd intended to teach Daniel about loving someone beyond their bank account had instead taught her something darker, about human nature itself. What Elena couldn't know in this moment of devastation, as wine dripped from her dress and divorce papers crumpled in her shaking hands, was that her greatest test of character was still ahead, and that a man disguised as poor as she'd disguised herself as ordinary would soon enter her life, helping her through childbirth and single motherhood, with a kindness that expected nothing in return, proving that authentic love existed even if she'd failed to find it the first time. And when she finally showed them all who she really was, when the in-laws who'd cheered her humiliation discovered they'd been living on her charity while spitting in her face, when Daniel realized he'd divorced the sole heiress to an empire that made his company look like a lemonade stand, would their kneeling and begging for mercy be enough to satisfy the justice they deserved? Or would the true victory be found in the family of 6 children she'd built with a man who loved her first as a struggling single mother before ever knowing about the billions? This narrative explores the dangerous intersection of hidden identity testing in relationships, the corrosive effects of unchecked ambition on family values, the redemptive power of authentic love found in unexpected places, and how true character reveals itself through actions toward those perceived as powerless. You will understand the risks of concealing one's true self, even for noble reasons, how betrayal often comes from those we've sacrificed the most for, the psychology behind family loyalty corrupted by social ambition, why true character is measured by how we treat those we perceive as powerless, and how second chances at love can heal even the deepest wounds when built on genuine foundations. This story delivers powerful lessons about maintaining dignity in the face of betrayal, the importance of authenticity in all relationships, the karmic nature of justice, how true strength is demonstrated through restraint rather than retaliation, and the beautiful reality that genuine love recognizes value beyond wealth, all while providing the emotionally satisfying narrative of the underestimated rising to reclaim their power, the arrogant facing consequences for their cruelty, and the ultimate reward of finding true love and building a happy family with someone who valued character over currency. The crystal chandeliers of the Grand View Hotel cast prismatic light across 500 faces, each one a witness to what should have been Elena's triumph, though the wine soaking through her white silk dress told a different story entirely. The liquid was warm. Vanessa had held the glass long enough to ensure maximum staining capacity, her red manicured fingers releasing it with the precision of someone who'd rehearsed this public execution in her mind countless times before tonight. Elena's hand moved instinctively to her stomach, a protective gesture that had become automatic in her 7th month of pregnancy, though the baby kicked as if sensing the danger radiating from every direction in this ballroom that suddenly felt more like a courtroom. "Sign them." Daniel's voice carried the same tone he used with vendors who'd failed to meet deadlines, devoid of the warmth that had once made Elena believe in fairy tales, despite her family's warnings about fortune. "Hunters." His hand extended toward her with divorce papers that somehow looked freshly printed, despite the gala happening in real time, suggesting premeditation that made the betrayal cut deeper than the initial shock. "I've had my lawyers review everything. You'll get nothing beyond what the prenup stipulates, which I believe amounts to about $50,000 given your minimal contribution to the marriage." The crowd had formed a circle now, their champagne glasses held at chest level like shields, their eyes hungry for drama that would fuel gossip for months across the city's social circuit. Elena recognized faces she'd smiled at for 3 years, business partners Daniel had secured through her family's secret machinations, investors her trust had anonymously guaranteed, even the mayor whose campaign her foundation had funded without credit. But none of them stepped forward to question the spectacle, their silence a complicity that spoke volumes about the world she'd been naive enough to think she could test through disguise. "Danielle, please." Elena's voice emerged smaller than she intended, though part of her recognized this diminishment as strategic. Let him think her weak. Let them all see her as the discarded wife with nowhere to turn. Let the truth wait for its perfect moment of revelation. "We can talk about this privately. The baby will be fine." Daniel's mother materialized beside Vanessa like a guardian angel for the wrong cause, her hand resting possessively on the mistress's shoulder in a gesture that inverted every natural instinct of maternal protection. Margaret Thornton had been the first to welcome Elena into the family 3 years ago, weeping tears of joy at the wedding, calling her the daughter I always prayed for during intimate Sunday dinners. But those same eyes now held contempt that seemed rehearsed, as if she'd been waiting for permission to unleash judgments she'd harbored all along. Vanessa has already agreed to help raise the child properly, with the values and breeding that befits the Thornton name, rather than the lower-class habits you've unfortunately demonstrated. The words landed like physical blows, each one calculated to strip away dignity in front of an audience that fed on such cruelty. Elena felt her knees weaken, though whether from the emotional assault or the physical strain of carrying new life, while her current life collapsed, remained unclear in the moment. She reached for the nearby cocktail table to steady herself, her fingers brushing against divorce papers that Daniel had now placed there like a restaurant check waiting to be settled. I think what my son is trying to say, Richard Thornton's voice boomed from behind her, with the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question, is that this marriage was always a mismatch. You're a lovely girl, Elena, but Vanessa here. He gestured toward the mistress with the pride of someone presenting a prized acquisition. She understands our world. Her father owns the Westbrook hotel chain. Her mother sits on the symphony board, and she graduated summa cum laude from Princeton. No offense intended, but your community college degree and secretary background were always going to limit how far Daniel could rise in society. The irony would have been laughable if it weren't so painful. Richard Thornton praising hotel ownership while standing in a hotel Elena's family had owned for 40 years, complimenting symphony board connections when Elena's grandmother had founded the very symphony he referenced, celebrating Princeton credentials when Elena held dual master's degrees from Cambridge under her real name. But the most cutting irony was watching them all champion Vanessa's supposed breeding and class, while the mistress stood there with wine still dripping from her fingers, having just committed an act of violence disguised as accident that would have scandalized the very society they claimed to represent. "Sign the papers, Elena?" Vanessa's voice carried a musical quality that might have sounded sweet in different circumstances, though now it landed with the sharpness of broken glass. Daniel deserves someone who can actually help his career instead of holding him back with your limitations. Elena's fingers touched the pen Daniel had placed beside the divorce papers, her hand trembling in a way that made the onlookers lean forward with anticipation, their collective breath held as if watching the final moments of an execution they'd paid premium tickets to witness. But instead of signing, she pulled out her phone, the cheap Android device Daniel had always mocked as evidence of her inability to manage money properly, and dialed a number she'd memorized years before her marriage, back when her identity was still intact and her heart hadn't yet learned the specific flavor of public betrayal. "William, it's Elena Montgomery." Her voice dropped the Rodriguez surname like a costume she'd worn too long, the syllables of her real name feeling foreign on her tongue after 3 years of hiding. "I'm at the Grandview Hotel. I need you to bring the full documentation, ownership papers, investment records, everything. And William, bring security. We're about to have some trespassers removed from my property." The shift in the room's atmosphere was immediate, though not yet comprehending. Daniel's hand froze mid-reach toward her, his face cycling through confusion, before settling on irritation at what he clearly perceived as some desperate bluff. But Margaret Thornton's expression showed the first crack of uncertainty. She'd spent enough time in elite circles to recognize that people who made calls to someone named William with that particular tone of authority usually had the power to back it up. "What kind of game is this?" Vanessa's musical voice now carried sharp edges, her perfectly manicured hand tightening on Daniel's arm in a possessive gesture that suddenly looked more like desperation than triumph. "You can't just make prank calls to delay the inevitable. Sign the papers or we'll have you removed for causing a scene at Daniel's company event." "My company event," Elena corrected softly, her other hand still resting protectively on her pregnant belly, while her eyes scanned the crowd for the hotel manager she knew would be somewhere in this ballroom. "More accurately, an event held in my family's hotel, celebrating the 3-year anniversary of a company that would have declared bankruptcy 18 months ago if my investment consortium hadn't purchased all of Daniel's debts and restructured his entire business model. But please do continue telling me about my limitations and lower-class habits. I'm finding this educational." The crowd's murmur started as a whisper, but grew into a wave of confused speculation. Several people pulled out their phones, fingers already flying across screens as they searched for information that Elena knew they'd find. Business journals documenting the Montgomery Global Consortium's mysterious rescue of Thornton Technologies, society pages featuring photos of Elena Montgomery at charity galas years before her marriage, Forbes articles about the reclusive trillionaire heiress who disappeared from public life 3 years ago for reasons the press could only speculate about. "You're lying." Daniel's voice carried less conviction than his words suggested, his eyes darting between Elena's face and his mother's increasingly pale complexion. "Elena Rodriguez from Queens, who worked as my secretary, who could barely afford rent before we married. You expect anyone to believe you're some secret heiress?" "I don't expect anything." Elena felt the baby kick again, harder this time, as if the child inside her was celebrating the death of deception, even while mourning the father who'd chosen cruelty over curiosity. "I simply stated facts that William will verify in approximately—" She glanced at her phone's timestamp, 4 minutes. "But since we have time, let me address a few specific points. Margaret, the townhouse you've lived in for the past 2 years, the one you believed Daniel purchased for you as a Mother's Day gift, that's 447 Riverside Drive, property of Montgomery Family Trust, which I've allowed you to occupy rent-free while you insulted my cooking, criticized my clothes, and made jokes about my unfortunate background at every family dinner." Margaret's champagne glass slipped from her fingers, shattering against the marble floor with a sound that punctuated Elena's revelation like an exclamation point. The older woman's face had drained of color, her hand reaching for her husband's arm in a mirror of Vanessa's earlier gesture, though Richard looked equally stricken as connections began forming in his businessman's mind. "Richard, those miraculous contracts that saved Thornton Technologies last year," Elena continued, her voice gaining strength with each word as 3 years of suppressed truth finally found release. "The military defense contract worth $40 million, that came through Montgomery Aerospace, a subsidiary my grandfather founded in 1952. The hospital equipment deal that Daniel celebrated as his breakthrough moment, Montgomery Medical supplied those hospitals for 30 years before your son was born, and that investor meeting in Singapore that Daniel claimed secured your company's future. I was in the room, not as Elena Rodriguez, the secretary, but as Elena Montgomery, the primary shareholder voting to approve the bailout package that prevented your bankruptcy." The ballroom doors opened with perfect timing, revealing William Chen, her family's chief counsel for 40 years, flanked by 2 Montgomery Global security personnel, whose presence transformed the atmosphere from social gathering to corporate takeover. William carried a leather portfolio that Elena recognized as containing documentation that could destroy lives with the weight of truth. His silver hair and immaculate suit projecting the authority of someone who'd negotiated with presidents and CEOs while Daniel was still learning his multiplication tables. "Ms. Montgomery," William's formal acknowledgement of her real name rippled through the crowd like an electric current, triggering a fresh wave of frantic phone searches and shocked whispers. "I have the documents you requested. Shall we proceed with the property reclamation and contract terminations?" The leather portfolio opened with a sound that seemed magnified in the sudden silence, papers emerging like evidence at a trial where the verdict had already been written in invisible ink 3 years ago. William spread documents across the cocktail table where divorce papers still waited for a signature they would never receive. Each page a revelation that transformed Elena from discarded wife into puppet master of the very empire her husband had pretended to build through his own merit. "Let's begin with property ownership." William's voice carried the measured tone of someone accustomed to delivering information that changed lives, his finger tracing down a list that made Daniel's face progressively lose color with each address. "The Grandview Hotel where we currently stand, Montgomery Property Holdings, purchased 1984. The Thornton Technologies headquarters building on Madison Avenue, Montgomery Commercial Real Estate, lease agreement signed by Elena Montgomery 3 months before your wedding, Mr. Thornton, with rental fees waived as a personal favor to her then-fiancé. Your Hamptons summer house that you believed was a bargain foreclosure purchase. Montgomery Coastal Properties sold it to you for $1, while the actual market value was $8.7 million. Vanessa's hand slipped from Daniel's arm as if his skin had suddenly become toxic, her eyes calculating odds that were shifting too rapidly to track. The mistress who'd thrown wine with such confidence now looked like someone realizing they'd slapped a queen while thinking she was a peasant, her red-bottomed heels taking small backward steps that suggested flight instinct overriding the predatory confidence she'd displayed moments earlier. That's not possible. Daniel's protest sounded weak even to his own ears, his businessman's mind already processing numbers that didn't add up unless Elena's claim was legitimate. The investors, the contracts, the business, growth. I built that through my own strategic vision and negotiation skills. You built it through Elena's strategic financing and her family's connections, though you were permitted to believe otherwise as part of her social experiment. William pulled out another document, this one stamped with the seal of Montgomery Global Consortium's investment division. Every major contract your company secured in the past 3 years was facilitated by Montgomery subsidiaries or partner organizations. The venture capital firm that provided your Series B funding, Montgomery Ventures, with Elena as the primary decision-maker who approved your application despite 7 other firms rejecting it as too high risk. The manufacturing deal with Chen Industries that you celebrated as proof of your business acumen? That's my brother's company, and he took the meeting as a personal favor to Elena after she asked him to give you a chance. Margaret Thornton's knees buckled, forcing Richard to catch her weight as the reality of their situation crystallized with devastating clarity. The family who'd spent 3 years treating Elena as beneath them, who'd mocked her modest car and simple clothes, who'd celebrated her replacement with a woman they perceived as more suitable. They were learning that they'd been living as parasites on the very person they'd deemed unworthy of basic respect. The prenuptial agreement Daniel forced me to sign. Elena's voice cut through the chaos of whispered conversations and frantic phone calls happening throughout the ballroom. The one protecting his assets from my supposed gold-digging intentions? My lawyers allowed it to stand because the Montgomery fortune is held in trusts that predate our marriage by 4 generations. That prenup protects approximately $4 million in company stock and personal assets. Meanwhile, my family's net worth... She paused, letting the number hang in the air like a guillotine. Blade currently exceeds $1.2 trillion across global holdings in aerospace, medical technology, commercial real estate, and sustainable energy. So Daniel, when you tell me I'll receive nothing beyond the $50,000 stipulated in our prenup, you're technically correct, though not for the reasons you imagine. The wine stain on Elena's dress had dried into a map of humiliation that would remain visible for the rest of the evening, though its symbolism had inverted, no longer evidence of her powerlessness, but rather a permanent record of the night the Thornton family destroyed their only bridge to unimaginable wealth and influence through their own arrogance and cruelty. Please. The word came from Margaret, though it emerged as barely a whisper, her previous contempt replaced by dawning horror as she calculated everything they'd lost in the span of 15 minutes. Elena, sweetheart, there's been a terrible misunderstanding. You have to understand. You believed I was poor, so you treated me as disposable. Elena interrupted, her hand moving protectively over her pregnant belly as the baby kicked, as if the child inside sensed its mother finally reclaiming her power. You believed I was ordinary, so you celebrated my replacement with someone you perceived as extraordinary. You believed I needed you, so you felt entitled to cruelty disguised as family dynamics. But you never once asked yourselves why a secretary could afford to anonymously pay your medical bills when Richard had his heart attack, or how a woman with a community college degree could speak 5 languages fluently, or why someone supposedly struggling financially never once asked Daniel for money despite him constantly offering to help me budget better. Richard Thornton dropped to his knees with an impact that echoed across marble floors, his pride dissolving in the face of consequences he'd never anticipated. His hands clasped together in a gesture of supplication that would have seemed theatrical if the desperation weren't so genuine, his voice cracking as words tumbled out in a rush. Everything we have, our home, our company, our reputation, it all traces back to you. Elena, please, we made a mistake, a terrible mistake, but you can't destroy our entire family because of one night of poor judgment. One night? Elena's laugh held no humor, only the bitter recognition of self-deception finally shattered. This wasn't one night, Richard. This was 3 years of testing whether any of you could love someone you perceived as beneath your social station. 3 years of watching you tolerate me as long as you believed I was the best your son could attract. 3 years of waiting for even one moment where you defended me instead of diminishing me. And tonight, when your true characters were finally revealed, without the restraint of social necessity, you chose to cheer for the woman who physically assaulted your pregnant daughter-in-law, rather than question why your son would abandon his wife and child at a public event. Vanessa had disappeared into the crowd, her red dress vanishing between bodies that parted for her exit like a sea rejecting pollution. The mistress who'd thrown wine with such theatrical confidence had recognized the ending of this story. Before the Thornton family could fully process it, she'd hitched her ambitions to a sinking ship, captained by a man who'd just discovered his entire success was built on borrowed power that was now being permanently revoked. The divorce papers Daniel wanted me to sign. Elena picked them up with fingers that no longer trembled, her voice steady with the conviction of someone who'd finally stopped pretending to be smaller than her actual size. I'll sign them gladly, but not because I'm powerless, because I choose freedom from people who measure love in dollars and loyalty in social advancement. William, please file the necessary paperwork to terminate all financial support to Thornton Technologies, revoke the property leases, and recall the loans that were restructured under the assumption of family connection, and arrange immediate eviction proceedings for 447 Riverside Drive. No! Margaret's scream carried the pitch of someone watching their entire world collapse in real time. Elena, please, we have nowhere to go. The company will declare bankruptcy by next quarter. Without your backing, we'll lose everything. You'll lose everything you never actually earned. Elena corrected gently, her hand accepting the coat that William had thoughtfully brought for her, covering the wine-stained dress that had become both evidence and metaphor. You'll lose the lifestyle you built on my charity while treating me with contempt. You'll lose the social status you achieved through my connections while mocking my background. Perhaps losing everything you took for granted will teach you something about gratitude, though I suspect you'll more likely learn about consequences. She walked toward the ballroom exit, with William flanking her protectively, her pregnant silhouette framed by chandeliers that cast light on a transformation complete. Behind her, the sound of Margaret's weeping mixed with Richard's desperate pleas and Daniel's stunned silence created a symphony of regret that was simultaneously satisfying and hollow. Justice served, but at the cost of innocence lost and faith in humanity shattered. The last thing Elena heard before the doors closed was Daniel's voice, finally breaking through his shock. Elena, wait, the baby. You can't raise my child alone. You need support. I need nothing from people who valued me, only when they thought I was desperate. Her response floated back through closing doors. Your child will know their worth isn't determined by their bank account, and they'll learn to treat others with dignity, regardless of social station. 2 lessons you never bothered to teach yourselves. 6 months after the gala, Elena gave birth to a daughter she named Sophia in a private hospital room that overlooked Central Park, though the view couldn't distract from the loneliness that accompanied bringing life into the world without a hand to hold or a voice to whisper encouragement through the pain. Her grandmother had passed 3 weeks earlier, taking with her the last family connection that had made the Montgomery fortune feel like something beyond numbers in accounts Elena rarely accessed. The lawyers sent flowers, the board members sent gift baskets, but none of them stayed through the 20-hour labor that left Elena exhausted in ways that had nothing to do with physical strain and everything to do with the realization that wealth could buy everything except the presence of people who loved you for reasons beyond inheritance. The nurses were kind in their professional way, but Elena could see the curiosity in their eyes, the questions they were too polite to ask about. Why a trillionaire heiress was giving birth alone, without even a friend present to document the moment, with photos that would never grace social media. The truth was that Elena had spent 3 years testing Daniel's love by pretending to be ordinary, and in doing so, she'd isolated herself from everyone who'd known her before the experiment began. Her real friends from her Cambridge days had drifted away during her absence from their world, assuming her disappearance meant disinterest rather than disguise. And the friends she'd made as Elena Rodriguez, the other secretaries, the women from her building, had all been Daniel's connections, people who'd vanished from her life the moment the divorce became public knowledge. But it was in the weeks following Sophia's birth, when Elena moved into a modest apartment in Brooklyn under her Rodriguez alias rather than returning to the Montgomery penthouse on Fifth Avenue, that she encountered the kind of human goodness that her wealth experiment had been searching for in the wrong places. The apartment building superintendent was a man named James Parker, who wore paint-stained jeans and drove a 15-year-old truck and helped Elena carry the second-hand crib up 3 flights of stairs without asking why a woman who could clearly afford better was choosing to live in a walk-up with inconsistent heating. "First baby?" James had asked that initial day, his smile genuine in a way that reminded Elena of her grandfather before the Montgomery Empire consumed his final years. "My wife and I raised 4 kids in this building before she passed. If you ever need anything, advice, emergency babysitting, someone to fix that radiator that's going to start making weird noises around November, just knock on 1A. What Elena couldn't know in that moment, wouldn't discover until much later, through a conversation that would change everything, was that James Parker was actually James Westwood, the reclusive billionaire who'd sold his tech company for $3 billion 8 years earlier and then disappeared from Silicon Valley's social circuit to live a life defined by service rather than status. He'd lost his wife to cancer 2 years ago, and in his grief, he'd discovered that fixing other people's broken radiators somehow helped repair the broken places in his own heart. Their friendship developed in small increments measured by the daily rhythms of new motherhood. James showing up at Elena's door with groceries when he noticed she hadn't left the apartment in 3 days, teaching her how to install the car seat properly when her hands shook from exhaustion and fear. Sitting with Sophia for 2 hours on the night Elena caught the flu so severe she couldn't lift her head from the pillow without the room spinning. He never asked about Sophia's father, never questioned why Elena seemed simultaneously wealthy enough to not need employment yet lived like someone counting pennies, never treated her as anything other than a struggling single mother who deserved kindness without interrogation. "You're good at this," Elena told him one evening, 6 months into their friendship, watching James rock Sophia to sleep with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this hundreds of times before. The helping thing. Most people offer support but mean it conditionally. They'll help if it's convenient, if it makes them feel good, if there's something in it for them eventually. But you just show up. James looked up from Sophia's sleeping face, his eyes carrying the weight of losses Elena didn't yet know about, but could sense in the spaces between his words. I spent 20 years building a company, making money, climbing social ladders I didn't even want to climb, except everyone around me said that's what success looked like. And then my wife got sick, and I discovered that all the money and all the status and all the business connections couldn't buy me 5 more minutes with the person I loved. So when she died, I asked myself what kind of life would honor her memory. And the answer wasn't another startup or another fortune. It was this: being present for people who need help, expecting nothing except the opportunity to be useful. Elena felt tears forming before she could stop them, the emotional walls she'd built since the gala finally cracking under the pressure of encountering someone whose actions matched his words without requiring tests or disguises to verify authenticity. James, I need to tell you something about who I really am. You're Elena Rodriguez, a single mother doing her best to raise a beautiful daughter while healing from whatever pain you're running from. James said it with such certainty that Elena almost believed he truly didn't know, though the way his eyes held hers suggested otherwise. That's all I need to know unless you decide you want to share more. But Elena did want to share more, needed to share more, because for the first time since the gala, she'd found someone whose kindness wasn't motivated by what they could gain from the Montgomery name. Over the next hour, as Sophia slept peacefully in James's arms, Elena revealed everything: the trillionaire heiress testing love through disguise, the husband who'd chosen a mistress over his pregnant wife, the in-laws who'd cheered her humiliation before discovering their entire lifestyle depended on her charity, the loneliness that came from realizing wealth could build empires, yet couldn't construct a single genuine relationship. I was James Westwood, he said when she finished, his voice carrying no pride in the revelation, only acknowledgement of a past life he'd chosen to leave behind. I sold Cloud Tech Systems 8 years ago for $3 billion, gave half to cancer research in my wife's name, put the rest in trusts for my grandchildren, and then I just walked away, started fixing things for people who couldn't afford to pay repair companies, started living in buildings I used to own as investments, but never actually saw as homes filled with humans struggling through life, started being present instead of profitable. The parallel wasn't lost on Elena, 2 people who'd tested life from opposite directions, she by pretending to have less while he'd chosen to live with less, both seeking the same answer to whether human goodness could exist independent of financial transaction. But where her experiment had failed spectacularly, his had revealed a truth she'd been too focused on Daniel to see. Authentic love wasn't found through deception, but through the vulnerable act of showing up honestly and allowing others to do the same. Their courtship was unconventional by society standards, but perfect by measures that actually mattered. James teaching Elena how to change her own radiator so she'd never be dependent on someone else's willingness to help. Elena teaching James that accepting support wasn't weakness, but rather the foundation of genuine partnership. He proposed 14 months after Sophia's birth with a ring that cost $200 from a local jeweler, its value measured not in carats, but in the fact that he'd noticed Elena admiring similar designs during their walks through Brooklyn's vintage shops. I'm not offering you billions or social status or anything beyond my promise to show up every day and value you regardless of whether you're Elena Rodriguez or Elena Montgomery, James said, as he knelt in the apartment where they'd built friendship before romance. But if you'll have me, I promise to raise Sophia as my own daughter and build whatever family we create together on foundations of honesty instead of tests. Elena said yes through tears that tasted different from the ones she'd cried at the gala. These carried hope instead of devastation, possibility instead of betrayal. They married quietly 6 months later in a ceremony attended by 12 people who loved them for their character, rather than their bank accounts, though Elena noticed James had invited the Thornton family to witness her happiness, not as revenge, but as evidence that their cruelty hadn't destroyed her capacity for joy. Daniel stood in the back of the small chapel, his presence a surprise until Elena recognized it as a closure. He'd lost his company to bankruptcy proceedings 9 months after the gala. His parents had downsized to a modest apartment in New Jersey, and Vanessa had married a different wealthy target within weeks of Daniel's financial collapse. But what struck Elena most was the genuine happiness she felt seeing him there, not because his suffering satisfied some need for revenge, but because his presence confirmed she'd moved beyond bitterness into something transcendent. Over the next 8 years, Elena and James built a family that eventually included 6 children, Sophia and 5 more, each one raised in an environment where wealth was acknowledged but never flaunted, where kindness was valued above achievement, where helping others was considered success more meaningful than any business victory. They split their time between the Brooklyn apartment, where they'd fallen in love, and the Montana ranch James had purchased as a retreat, teaching their children that home was defined by presence rather than property value. Elena never returned to active management of Montgomery Global Consortium, instead transforming it into a foundation focused on supporting single mothers, funding programs that taught financial literacy without judgment, and creating pathways for people to rebuild lives after betrayal or loss. James partnered with her in this work, his tech expertise complementing her business acumen in ways that multiplied their impact beyond what either could have achieved separately. On their 10th anniversary, as they watched their 6 children play in the yard of their Montana home, James asked Elena if she ever regretted the years she'd spent testing Daniel's love through disguise. She thought about it carefully before answering, her hand finding his with the automatic comfort of a decade spent building trust through consistent presence rather than dramatic gestures. "I regret the method, though I'm grateful for the lesson," Elena said finally, her eyes tracking Sophia, now 12 years old, as she helped her youngest brother climb the tree swing James had built last summer. "I thought I was testing whether someone could love me without money, though what I actually learned was that love isn't something you can test or verify through experiments. It's something you build daily through showing up honestly and allowing yourself to be seen completely. You taught me that. And these 6 beautiful children are living proof that the right love was worth waiting for." The Thornton family never fully recovered from their fall, though Elena ensured they weren't destroyed entirely. She'd paid off their remaining debts anonymously and helped Richard find modest employment through a Montgomery subsidiary that didn't advertise the connection. Not because she forgave their cruelty, but because she'd learned that mercy was more powerful than revenge, and that her children would inherit her character more than her fortune. And sometimes late at night, when James held her close in the darkness of their bedroom, Elena thought about that gala 6 years earlier, the wine-stained dress, the divorce papers, the in-laws who cheered her humiliation, and she felt grateful for the breaking that had preceded this beautiful building. Because authentic love, she'd discovered, could only be constructed on foundations cleared of deception, watered with genuine presence, and cultivated through the daily choice to value character over currency in all its forms.